There are several trends, and I think what really drives the escalation in cost is that they seem to converge particularly dramatically now. One is, of course, urbanization and just more people living on the same resource base, and we're really living more together in dense urban areas than ever before in human history. You know, we've seen the figures of over 50% of the world population live in cities, but in Latin America, for example, this is 80%. So just sort of bringing everyone together. Secondly, the world is richer and richer. So the fact that we have more wealth, of course, increases the wealth that is also lost. There is clear evidence that very rapid economic development also drives disaster losses. And some of the key indicators that we have for how the disaster risk and exposure is increasing is that in the past 30 years, the world population has increased with 87%. In the same period, the population that lives in cyclone-prone coastlines has increased with 194%. And that's, of course, where business also wants to expand, building infrastructure, being where there is labor force, transport, and consumers. So as you can see, how all these things come together, that drives disaster risk and disaster losses in economic terms. First of all, the private sector is part of society. So, you know, without them, you cannot reduce risk. But also private sector is, you know, in any country in the world today represents 75 to 90% of all investments. So all the investments done in infrastructure, in commerce, is really generated by private sector. So not integrating private sector in a fully way, you're not going to reduce risk sustainably. It's as simple as that, I see. So you cannot run this only as a government agenda and try to regulate something like that. You actually need a self-interested business that also says, if our business is going to be resilient, if we want to protect our investments, we also need to think about how to manage risk from natural hazards. Business manage lots of risks. Financial risk, reputational risk, but few of them seem to really have thought about the risk from natural hazards. Increasingly now, I think these Asian disasters last few years, with the Australian flooding, New Zealand earthquake, the Japanese, of course, tsunami earthquake, and the Thai floods. And now, of course, Superstorm Sandy in the United States last year. What they have really exposed is how economically interconnected the world is today. So a disaster impact has no borders anyway. It has no borders from an economic perspective. You see how supply chains are being disrupted. The Thai floods caused a 3% dip in global GDP. I think individual companies also realized, you know, they have this on-time supply of spare parts. And I heard a senior manager of Toyota explaining that before the earthquake in Japan and the floods in Thailand, they had no idea how their small supply chain, what it looked like. They didn't have a phone number. They didn't know the name of the place. They hardly knew where they were. So after that, they've completely reviewed this, and now they actually have fewer, but they also know who they are. They can get in touch with them, and they can reorganize themselves so that their supply chain work. So I really think that that's the economic value, but there's also a social aspect of it. Lots of companies in Thailand after the floods, for them it became evident with that long closure that they were forced to have, that their workers started disappearing. You know, their workforce, they went for jobs elsewhere, they moved, so they would have to rebuild the workforce, very costly. The customers, the clients, you know, if you are a company, you want to have the trust of your clients, so even if you have a disruption, you can come back to the marketplace. So I think all these elements have now made it into their thinking. But it's true, I don't know if you ever look at the World Economic Forum, they're doing this global survey about what CEOs worry about. And a few years ago, their worry about hazards was very high, and now it's something else that is the top worry. So that varies, of course, for them, like for the rest of us, with how many high-profile, really costly disasters there are. So in a way, you could argue that it's a benefit to their business continuity planning and awareness that there has been so many of these big catastrophes. And if we have one or even two every year from now on, if that is the way the future is going to look, there is no doubt in my mind that business is going to take this extremely seriously. It's turned out to have been an excellent, it's really been a common framework. It's created a common language, a sense of perception, a direction given by its priorities and goals and action. So in literally almost every country in the world, it has actually started building the foundations of a system for managing risk. It's very clear. It's helped awareness, and it's created a common basis for thinking about risk management. It certainly has saved lives, particularly the rapid spread of early warning systems, much better preparedness systems, and governments' capacity to respond to disasters. That saved lives, for sure. The question is, can we keep up? Are we able to keep up with the increase of risk, economic exposure, in terms of everything that is being done? And I would say not yet. But when we now move, since we are now in the middle of discussions about the next HFA, so to say, the HFA2, what that has to achieve, that's a common call from all the people in discussion. We have to have a strong focus on these new combined risks as we see them. It has to be very inclusive. It has to involve all stakeholders, including business, of course. I hope they will be on the stage and making commitments and say this will be our contribution and our engagement in reducing risk. Not only business, but all the other parts of society as well. And hopefully also be able to shape that clarion call for imagination, anticipation, and making managing risk as a very normal, inclusive part of social planning and business planning.